Get yourself a snack, it's gonna be a long one. I remember back when I was a kid, back in the year 2001. I was a massive fan of Pokemon. I owned Pokemon Blue, and I would play that Game Boy cartridge for as long as our household had available batteries. I was obsessed with the game. I didn't own any of the cards yet. I would play the TCG for a bit during my university days, and to this day, I haven't watched much of the show. Despite this, my mind was constantly running wild with ideas for what this new and exciting world could potentially offer. I was an eccentric kid, with a love for action and adventure films like Star Wars and Raiders of the Lost Ark, so naturally I dreamt of getting to explore and fight alongside my Pokemon against injustice and save the world. You know, instead of just telling them to do the fighting and watching from the sidelines. As years went by, I didn't end up owning another Pokemon game until Pokemon Y came out in 2013. I played the game and I enjoyed myself, but when I finished it, I came to a realization that I had grown up, gone through a lot of changes, but Pokemon really hadn't changed at all. 13 years is a long time to avoid meaningful change, not just in game design, but in life. Change is the one thing we can count on to be consistent, and working to keep something from the potential to change often leaves you wasting your time, wondering where you went wrong. After coming to this realization, I looked back to check how many Pokemon games came out between Blue and Y, and I was left very disappointed by the lack of imagination and ambition displayed by those in control of this potentially endless well of exciting potential. I would go on to give Pokemon one last shot with Pokemon Sword in 2019, and after that, I fully understood that so long as nothing rose to challenge Pokemon, it would never improve, and it would continue to milk the nostalgia and hopes of its dedicated fanbase for something new and exciting until the IP wasn't turning a profit anymore. You gotta love a franchise all about evolution that refuses to evolve itself. Jump to 2021. A trailer drops for a game called Palworld, created by a company called Pocket Pair. It looks like a Pokemon game, in some areas little too much like a Pokemon game, but it shows a lot of great stuff, offering exploration, combat with your Pokemon, being able to use guns, showing how Pokemon could be useful outside of combat, sometimes to a morally questionable degree. What? Something different? Potential? Jump to the game's release date of January 19th, 2024, and it goes on to sell a ridiculous amount of copies. A redonkulous figure. Just an absolutely ridiculous. I watched streams of people playing it for the first few days of its release skeptically, liking what I was seeing, but still torn on whether or not to buy it. Eventually, I said, screw it, why not? And I bought it, and I booted it up, and it was incredible. An interesting survival and workplace management game with combat similar to Remnant from the Ashes, but you can summon Pokemon? My first thought was, how has this never been done before? I felt like that exciting world I dreamt of in my youth was finally being realized. It was amazing. While Palworld has its flaws, it is a step forward. It's growth for a style of game that hasn't seen much of that since its inception. The players and fans of Pokemon all grew up, but this style of game or story never did. Just like Ash. Palworld feels like an exciting and new, albeit strange and at times quite messy, adolescence for this style of game. As of now, I've played the game a little bit.
Jesus Christ.
Just a little bit. At release, I played it a bunch, and then I took a long break from it after doing everything that I could in the game at that time. And I waited for some new content and quality of life updates to drop, and drop they have. And the game has improved immensely since then. But there is still room for improvement. I started over from scratch to get the full experience, and there's a lot to talk about, so let's get into it. From this point on, we're referring to the creatures as pals because we aren't talking about Pokemon. This is Palworld, and it has made itself distinct enough to be considered its own thing, for the most part. Let's quickly address the Cinderace in the room.
That's not Cinderace. That's Fair Dash.
I meant the Zoroark.
No. That's Incineram.
Electabuzz.
No, that's Grisbolt.
Apart from a few of the PAL designs being a little too close to some of the Pokemon designs, this game has made a great effort to be its own experience. First, we're talking about the PALs. There's a large amount of PALs in the game with different things they are good for. Land Balls generate Wolfie or Base. Caprides make berries. Jormuntide is great at watering plants and turning the water-powered mill and grinder, but it is also a great water combat pal. There are a total of 140 kinds of pal, with a total of 187 pals in this game as of writing this. There are more and more dropped with each big update that gets added to the game, of which there are plenty to come at this time. When I say kinds of pal, I have to mention that there are variants of certain pals that are a different elemental typing. But they aren't listed as a different type of pal, they are listed as a B type for that pal. For example, with Jormuntide, there is also Jormuntide Ignis, the fire version. So there's plenty of variety. One of my personal favorite pals is Cognito, who is not the greatest pal by any stretch, but it's just a very cool pal and a prime example of the creativity that has been displayed by the team at Pocket Pair. With all of this selection, you get to have 5 pals on your team, and you get to have as many pals working in your base as your PC can handle, based on the world settings that we'll talk about later. But I believe it is 15 in the base game settings for how many pals you can have at your base. I personally set it to 20. And recently moved it up to 25. In order to choose your 5 pals, there are many ways to go about it. Because of the pal-specific skills that either give your pal an extra attack in battle, or an ability that buffs you, the player, or the ability to be ridden as a ground or flying mount, to make travel not only easier, but to open up parts of the world that you may not have been able to reach before, or an ability that buffs pals that are of a specific elemental type. You could also just ignore all this and just make a team of the pals that you think are the coolest. However in-depth you want your pal team building to be, the possibilities are plenty. In order to get pals on your team, you will have to go into the wild and catch some using some pal spheres, just like in Pokemon. However, pals can be quite dangerous. If you are underleveled or ill-equipped to take on a high-level pal, they will destroy you. There's no fainting and waking up at your mom's house in this game, you just die. In the base game settings, when you die, you lose all of your belongings and all of your pals. They are left with your body. And if you don't have a spare flying mount in your base to go get your stuff, you might just be screwed and have to remake all of that. As IGN might say, this is the Dark Souls of Pokemon, and it really makes you feel like Palworld 7 out of 10. But truly, you have to be careful when fighting pals, which is something I really like about this game, which wasn't a feeling I had when I was playing Pokemon unless I was doing a Nuzlocke challenge, which, for the uninitiated, is when you impose rules of permadeath on your Pokemon and you can only catch the first Pokemon you encounter in an area. It's a set of restrictions that make the game significantly more difficult and more punishing. But it was not the game designer's intended experience. Pokemon at a baseline is that you're an 11-year-old kid and you're gonna go hunt some monsters. Any monsters able to be overcome by an 11-year-old kid are not monsters to be feared, especially if fainting in front of them has no consequences. Consequences like being eaten by them. Palworld is challenging and punishing without any outside rules applied by the players, and it feels like an evolution,
I understood that reference,
in the right direction for this type of game, and it treats its monsters with the appropriate respect they deserve. It also treats the early game monsters like the adorable little dudes that they are. Look at this guy. He's adorable. This game goes as far as having the first NPC you encounter being a horror-stricken survivor who lost all of their friends to pals who killed them with ease. Palworld goes hard. By the way, if you're enjoying the video, be sure to like it and subscribe for more content. Thanks again for watching. Back to the video. There are 3 pillars of play in Palworld: combat, base building and management, and exploration. I'll start with combat. Combat in Palworld is a very fun experience with a wide variety of weapons, pal team compositions, and movement options that make it a little more interesting than your baseline shooter. Let's talk about weapons. Guns, swords, laser swords, rocket launchers.
Hi.
The weapons list in this game feels like the combination of childhood me's favorite real-world weapons, as well as the crazy weapons that I would invent in my mind. What can I say? I played a lot of Command & Conquer Tiberian Sun as a kid. I like mechs, I like futuristic weaponry. I always have, and I always will.
In the name of Cain! In the name of Cain! Cain lives!
A lot of the weapons in this game eventually get outscaled by higher level pals and boss fights, so you will need to keep upgrading to the next tier of weaponry. However, you can find very rare loot drops of weapon schematics that are better versions of the weaponry that can sort of give them a little more longevity, with the early game weapons making their way to the mid game, and with the mid game weapons being able to be serviceable in the early late game. I would rather use an assault rifle rather than a musket. Getting these very rare schematics to drop can be very time consuming and repetitive work. With these schematics, there are various levels of them, and obviously you want to get the highest level of them, which is the golden schematics, and getting these golden schematics to drop can be quite tiresome and monotonous work, but when you get it, super worth it. The guns are great. Some of these legendary schematics in the late game have drop rates as low as 0.11%.
What?
To the guy who made these drop rates, listen, I just want to talk. That's all. I just want to have a quick little conversation. But that is something that you ought to be wary of if you're thinking about buying this game. There is a lot of grinding. Let's move on to PAL team compositions. As mentioned earlier, all PALs have what is called a partner skill. Some of these skills can buff you or other PALs in combat. Let's look at 2 ideas that I like for compositions. Number 1, type theme. This is when you pick an elemental type and have your whole team be PALs that are of that type, so you can cash in on a PAL that buffs PALs of that type. Hybrid type PALs work great in this concept because the damage on all of their attacks gets buffed, not just the dark attacks. For example, let's say you chose dark type. I love dark type. You could use Hookertease to buff all the damage of your dark type PALs attack stats. Then have Hellzephyr Lux for electric coverage, Incineram for fire coverage, Astagon for dragon coverage, and Shadowbeak for just max dark damage. Also for being a really good ground and airborne mount. An additional bonus to this style of team comp is that it makes you feel like a Pokemon gym leader. Number 2, player damage maxing. This composition involves using the PAL called Gobfin, or its fire type counterpart called Gobfin Ignis. You can buff your own player damage by up to 20% at maximum condensing level, which we'll talk about later, per Gobfin. But if you breed Gobfins that have the trait called Vanguard, which buffs player damage by an additional 10%, that's 30% per Gobfin.
That's a lot of damage. How about a little more? Yes. Yes! No. Wait.
Add in a PAL that has a PAL partner skill that applies an elemental typing to your attacks while you fight alongside it, or in some cases ride it.
Now that's a lot of damage.
Speaking of boss fights, there are normal boss fights and there are raid boss fights. There are a total of 7 normal boss fights as of me typing this with the recent addition of the Favour DLC, and there are 7 raid bosses. There are 4 kinds of PAL that are raid bosses: Bellenoir, Bellenoir Libero, Blazamut Ryu, and Xenolord. There are just different leveled versions of them, and they add up to 7 in total. Unlike in Pokemon, you, the trainer, actually participate in battles taking place, and in the late game, with the best gear, you will often outdamage your PALs, so player maxing is often thought to be the most effective team build. Aside from that, participating in fights means that you can always get hurt, and while you can wear the thickest armor the world can produce, the best defense is always no be there. Sprinting, dodging, grapple hooking, gliding, sliding, climbing, flying, slingshotting, these are all movement options not just for exploration and travel, but for combat as well. And learning to employ these tactics to use your environment to your advantage, while under the pressure of having a boss monster coming at you, is a very fun but challenging process. The AI for the enemies is quite dumb. I won't lie, it's a little stupid, but it usually ends up making me laugh rather than sighing in disappointment. So my opinion isn't swayed by this fact, but it is important to point out if that is a deal breaker for you. This is an indie game that is trying a lot of things at one time, made by devs that are kind of figuring this thing out as they go. So I don't expect perfection, but I find the AI struggles most with the human enemies rather than with the PALs. I think the PALs are fine. There is a fun but fairly rudimentary base building and workplace management system in Palworld. There's a lot of structures you need to have in your base in order to make the things that you need, and the true skill of this pillar of play comes from maximizing efficiency by placing structures in a way that optimizes not just your PAL's work skills, but also ensures that the PALs don't get stuck in a wall or a door or somewhere, or that their AI gets confused about which task to do despite being assigned to a specific work site. These problems happen very rarely for me now. After after the quality of life updates, but when the game first released, it was a fairly common issue. Nowadays, not so much. But to sum it up, you construct buildings on a very large grid, a grid that originates from wherever you place the first piece of the structure that you are building. I say the building system is rudimentary because of the size of the foundational pieces, but there are a lot of aesthetic pieces you can add to your base that makes the building system a little more interesting. However, and this is a big however, you aren't incentivized to research the aesthetic pieces because in order to unlock them, you have to spend tech points in the technology tree. Technology points are a valuable resource that you receive from leveling up or grinding out dungeons to find tech manuals that give you a couple of points on consumption. So technology points take a lot of time to come by. Overall, the building system is fun, but being restricted from getting to use the aesthetic building pieces because you have to research the essential buildings for game progression can feel pretty bad sometimes. Add in the fact that the amount of space you have to work with each base is just a little bit too small. And it leaves me feeling that the base building, while fun, is a little bit too limited for my liking. If you want to fit everything in one base, you are going to need to build vertically. You will also likely have to increase the amount of pals you can have on a base in the world settings, I'll talk about later, because in the base settings, there is not enough room to do everything you would need to do in this game in one base. Yes, you can have and will likely need a few bases, but Palworld is a game that is best played with friends.
That armor works better on your character, specifically because your character
shrunk.
Friends who you can fight bosses with. Friends who want to make their own PAL teams, and who very likely want to build their own bases too, because they want to express their creativity in all the ways that this game offers. In single player, the not having enough room issue is not an issue. One final thing I want to bring up is base defense. There are a lot of cool structures your pals can use to defend your base, and if the base size was just a bit bigger, I think I would use them more. But as of now, I just turn off base raids and build a giant wall around my base so that I don't have to worry about random pals wandering into my base. Let's move on to workers. So, as I mentioned before, pals can work in your base to automate production of essential resources that are used to upgrade your gear and your pals. How good a pal is at a certain job is denoted by its work suitability, which upon the catching or breeding of a pal can be a maximum of level 4, but can be upgraded to level 5 through condensation.
Oh, you silly cow.
We'll talk about that later. Or through making it to the endgame and finding extremely rare consumables that up work suitability of pals. Typically, stronger pals have better work suitability than weaker pals. For example, this giant flaming dragon snake thing has a better kindling work suitability than this adorable little firefox. Because look at this thing.
Mine's freaking huge! Mine's huge!
But there are some pals that have tasks that only they can do because it is tied to their partner skill. For example, Dumb Mud. If you put it to work in the ranch, it generates high quality pal oil, a very valuable item. No other pal can do that. It has a ranch work suitability of 1. Pals that have ranch work suitability are the ones that have the diverse uses of their skill. Otherwise, you just need to find the biggest number that you can. Finding the optimal amount of pals to do each necessary task while staying within the limits of your base population and the amount of food that your pals consume is a large part of managing your base. You can manage your workers on the monitoring stand by choosing how hard you want them all to work. Harder work means more injury, sanity loss, and hunger. You can assign them to do specific tasks and assigning what tasks you don't want them to do. It's a good system and it works. On top of managing work, you have to ensure that your pals are fed, have a place to relax from work, and have a place to sleep so that they don't die. The work management in this game is rather inhumane, but if you treat your pals well, they work harder for you. This is where the game being a satire of Pokemon comes into play. In Pokemon, you train monsters to fight for you, and nobody really thinks about how messed up that is. In this game, you have the free Pal Alliance, but more on them later. In Pokemon, you breed Pokemon for as long as it takes to get Pokemon with the best stats. It's eugenics, and eugenics is f***ed up. Everyone in Pokemon is evil. At least, if you think about it. Palworld further leans into and explores this part of the world of Pokemon by letting you breed not just pals with better traits for fighting, but also working. And when breeding isn't enough, you whip up some horrific Super Soldier Serum cocktail that permanently boosts its pal stats. Pokemon has always been this way. Palworld just acknowledges it, commits to it, and explores it, and shows how messed up it is. Yes, the first person you meet on the island tells you that pals are evil and to show no mercy because they murdered all of their friends, but they're a little biased. In order to succeed in this game, either you will have to do some evil things, or you may never complete all of the content that is in this game, especially the raid bosses. Sorry for the tangent there, I just love how this game is so blatantly honest about how horrible the world of Pokemon would most likely be to exist in. Thoughts like this would never have crossed my childhood mind because all my kid self could think was, look at this cool lightning bird, it's my favorite. I still love Zapdos, by the way. I'm not sure who my favorite Pokemon is anymore though. There are so many that I like, you know, like Phalanx. Look at these guys, look at these dudes. Anyways, back to the work system. The tasks that need to be done are kindling, burning stuff, planting, growing stuff, handiwork, helping build stuff, lumbering, chopping wood for stuff, medicine production, making meds to heal stuff, transporting, grabbing stuff and putting it somewhere else, watering, hosing stuff, generating electricity, powering stuff, gathering, harvesting stuff, mining minerals for stuff, cooling, chilling stuff, and farming, making stuff in the ranch. You won't need medicine production until the later game because you can buy all of the necessary medicines you need to heal your pals in the base from merchants. So mixing the base building optimization with the worker optimization, and you have a lot of tasks to think about. Most of your time spent will be on worker optimization, aka pal breeding and condensation. What is condensation? Condensing a pal is essentially taking a bunch of pals of the same type, tossing them into a giant blender, turning them into a protein shake, and feeding them to a pal of the same type. Maxing out a pal's condensation takes sacrificing 116 pals to the pal blender. Depending on what pal you are maxing out, this can be done quickly or it can take a very long time. Also, when you catch pals, they are revealed to have traits. There is a large pool of traits, and the only way to get a pal with 4 traits that you want is by breeding pals. The ideal way is by having 2 pals with 2 traits breeding together, but sometimes you have to work with what you have, putting a 4 trait with a traitless or whatever. As long as the traits you want are on the pals you are breeding, then you can start rolling the dice and seeing what ones stick, and what additional ones they get. This is one of the most annoying things about Palworld. The fact that even in the breeding process, you can still not get the traits you want on your pal. Sometimes you get it right away, but other times it takes forever. On top of that, if you want to take it a level deeper, Palworld embraced the Pokemon IV system, which first of all, why? Second of all, long story short, the IV system is another lottery you have to participate in, except unlike the trait lottery, you cannot rig the odds. IVs, or individual values, are stats for attack, defense, and HP that range from 0 to 100 that increase the values of those stats, but these are a hidden stat under the main stat. At least there's a way to actually see the numbers in this game, but it doesn't make it much better. Essentially, the best combat pal you could make would have 100 in all of these categories, and it would have all of the traits that you want, which if you were to breed for it in the base game, you would be playing the lottery forever. Palworld has items that can increase these values, but they cost a lot of resources and time to buy. If I were to have a list of things that needed to be changed because they were just poor design, the breeding system would be right at the top. I like gambling. Hell, I love gambling, but only if there is actually a real chance of winning and it doesn't take forever to see you win. Basically, if you want to make the most powerful team possible or just your ideal team, you're better off modding the game to save yourself time, or you can mess with the world settings to help speed some parts of the game up, depending on how far you want to go. Here's a resource to help you with planning your pal breeding pathways to find out what pal combinations make what pal. Also, another function of condensing pals is improving their partner skills and stats, which is always good. So no matter what function the pal fulfills in your team or in your base, it is always good to condense them fully, which means catching and breeding more pals, which means more time. This, in combination with base building and management, means you have plenty to do, just at your base alone, but you will have to head out at some point. Palworld boasts a very large map to explore, with a lot of reasons to explore, and a map that allows you to place markers on it, thank God. Seeing as we've already covered the ways to move around the world, let's talk about what we can find in it. Dungeons, boss fights, merchants, oil rig raids, scrap piles, lore journals, treasure chests. Almost all of these landmarks are just more opportunities to acquire more loot. And of course there are pals out in the world, and all of them have certain areas in which they spawn, which means you gotta travel to find new pals. While traveling, it is a good idea to keep an eye out for new potential base locations. To be honest, that's kind of the open and shut of this section. The exploration is simple but very fun and satisfying, the world is beautiful to look at, and that also enhances this pillar of play. One thing I have to say about this game is that all of these 3 pillars of play link into one another seamlessly, and it makes Palworld a very easy game to get addicted to for a while. In its current state, Palworld is still in early access, and a large part of the game that hasn't really seen much development is its story. There are little lore journals scattered around the map that give some lore to the world and some of its prominent characters, like its bosses and another individual known as the Castaway. But other than that, the story is basically getting the strongest pals you can so you can fight and protect yourself, exploring and setting up a fortress here on this collection of wildly dangerous islands, seemingly for the love of the game. Don't get me wrong. The lore that is present is pretty wild. There is a disgraced law enforcement officer who horribly mistreats his pal. It's crazy. Currently, there is no story for you to really interact with, no rival for you to beat, no NPCs to interact with in a way other than fighting them to progress the story, and no real overarching purpose to any of this. All we know about the story is that you are someone who wakes up in this place. Maybe they were shipwrecked, but essentially you have to get to the big tree. This sounds familiar. Except the tree isn't in the game yet. So currently, nothing matters. But I have an idea for where Pocket Pair could potentially take this story if they wanted to A, put in the effort, B, if it was technologically possible, and C, if they really wanted to do something awesome with the story. Look, it's my personal Palworld story idea. Here we go. So, this tree, it's clearly something immensely powerful. Powerful enough that there are multiple factions fighting for control of it, and for control of the islands. Control of the islands gives you control of the most powerful weapons in the known world currently, pals, as well as control over an untapped well of natural resources. Also, just so much oil.
Did I hear oil?
No, I didn't say anything about oil.
That shit is mine!
As a Canadian, that joke was a bit rough to make due to the circumstances right now. I'm terrified. And therefore, control of the area around the tree, and perhaps the world. Let's quickly list the factions. You have the Syndicate, the Free Pal Alliance, aka PETA, the Pal Research Organization, the Fabric Warriors, the Moonflower, the Palapagos Island Defense Force, the Brothers of the Eternal Pyre. That's a lot of factions. As it stands now, they are just a bunch of dudes to shoot who go when they die. If each faction had a different opinion on what to do with the tree and the islands, you could make several potential story paths where you then have to overcome the other factions in some way. Let's talk about their motivations. Let's say the Syndicate wants to weaponize the tree by studying its nature to make the most powerful weapons to essentially take over the world, and also to use it as leverage in any kind of negotiation that they end up having. The Free Pal Alliance wants to set up a faction headquarters here on the island and start illegal pal trading on the black market to make a bunch of money while pretending to be the front-facing organization that helps pals that it purports to be. Let's say they set it up where their pal boss tower is on Hypocrite Hill, but with regards to the tree, they want nothing to do with the tree. They want to leave it alone. The PAL Research Organization wants to study the tree and use it to manufacture new technology to give humans PAL abilities and to extend their lifespan. But they are very technology focused, and this organization is the type of organization that will plow the way through this ecosystem and not really care about the damage they're doing to the environment. The Fabric Warriors are a cult that believe that the tree is a remnant of an ancient civilization or perhaps a god, and they are preparing a ritual to harness the tree's power for some divine purpose that may or may not help the world. The Moonflower want everyone else to leave the tree alone, and they have no needs or wants from the island other than for it to continue to be their home. However, a lot of the Moonflower want to leave the islands because literally nothing happens there. But because of their responsibility to protect their home from the outsiders, and because they are duty-bound to stay on the islands, they don't leave. That's it. They just want everybody else to go away. The reason why this faction is not the guaranteed easy choice is because of the hook of the story. Whether it be the end of the world or otherwise, the answers to it lie within confronting the nature of the tree. So leaving it alone could be a bad choice. But if you were to follow through with this faction, you wouldn't find out until it was too late. The Palapagos Island Defense Force wants to preserve endangered species of pals, as they are not just of historical importance, but also of importance to the local ecosystem. They want to research the land to see if the origin of humanity is potentially tied to this collection of islands. They are a government organization, and their minor presence here is being headed by historians, not generals. It justifies them having placed the majority of their resources in the sanctuaries and their seeming ineffectiveness. Also, Marcus, the disgraced law enforcement officer we briefly mentioned earlier, is the guy you fight in the PIDF tower. So maybe he overthrew the leadership and now the faction is kind of aimless, except for their hatred of the Syndicate, which, oh yeah, by the way, they fucking hate the Syndicate. And they're here to try and stop them, despite being spread far too thin. And also with all the inner conflicts about what their goals ought to be after the leadership change has left this faction twisting in the wind. Finally, with the Brothers of the Eternal Pyre, another cult, except instead of harnessing the tree, they want to, you guessed it, burn that shit down. Come what may, the tree needs to go. They are all about the ideas of ascension through immolation and fire bringing new life to the world. They believe the world has lost its way over this tree, and they think that if the tree were just gone, it would kind of hard reset powerful people's values and motivations. With these factions, there is potential for debate about the tree between the faction members depending on their standing with each other, and there's potential to have large-scale combat encounters where you and your faction fight against other factions. Like the bits of lore we get about the Pokémon War in that universe, but instead we actually get to fight in it. How exciting would that be? And with all of these factions having their motivations, the tree, I don't know what the purpose is yet, I don't know if the devs even have an idea yet, but the tree has to be something, and it has to be doing something to the world that is either good or bad, and every faction has to be reasonable about their belief about the tree, regardless of how good or bad their belief would actually affect the world. Except the cults. Those guys can be crazy. Also, a lot of the journal entries that are already in the game feature a character referred to as the Castaway. They're the person who named the islands, and maybe that person's story ends up at the tree as well. Maybe that's just where they disappear. Maybe they discovered something about the tree that the world has to know about, but their mind is too far gone to communicate it properly. Whatever the power of the tree is, this guy discovered it, and he got f***ed up by it. Or maybe they died just on the edge of their discovery. That is all that I currently have ideas for. Rather than keeping the game in its current state as the various adventures and to-do lists of John Palworld.
Hi, it's me, Rash Scratchum.
And
Strong.
like this structure, this idea that I came up with, I came up with it in like 20 minutes. Someone who is an actual professional or experienced writer could have a heyday with this. I'm just sort of beginning my writing journey. This world is so rife with potential, and I hope that in the future of this game's development, we see the beginnings of a story developing, because it could be so awesome. However, despite all of this potential, realistically, I gotta curb my enthusiasm. I am sure that making Palworld go from what it is currently to everything that I have just talked about is likely impossible. But perhaps when this game is finished development, and if the developers decide to franchise this thing, and they decide to make another game,
Assuming also that Nintendo doesn't sue them into oblivion.
perhaps they could make a game where the story of this world is a little more deeply explored. But hey devs, if you see this, there's an idea for you. The sound of Palworld doesn't leave me with too much to say, which with regards to sound, unless it's exceptional, is kind of ideal. I'm never taken out of the experience by weird or broken sounds, and everything sounds good. The music in this game is awesome, especially the boss fights. Those tracks get you fired up, as they should. The visuals of Palworld are also pretty good. The vistas that are present in this game are beautiful. The character models look okay, the pals look good. Some pal designs are definitely better than others, as I've already said, but one thing that this game does very well with regards to the pal designs is how the pals' personalities are conveyed through their movement and work animations. For example, watch Eikthadir do lumbering. Now watch Masanda. Now look at Hellzephyr Lux relaxing in the hot spring. He looks so happy. Now look at Depresso.
Yeah, was that guy dead? What the hell?
There are plenty of great examples. This is my favorite part of the visuals of Palworld, and as the game has been updated, there are more pals with different animations and different personalities. This is also a fun way to consider building a pal team. The purely based on vibes team. One quick thing I have to mention is that some of the game's assets look a little too familiar. Like that's an Everjail, right? But I can brush that aside when the game is as fun and addicting as it is. In Palworld, you have the power to change what are called world settings, stuff that affects the game's difficulty, pace, and weight on your PC's system. You can increase the amount of pals in a map, the amount of pals that are allowed to work in your base, the amount of damage pals do to you, how much damage you do to pals, and so much more. There is a long list of things to change, and it is always worth looking at when you are starting your journey into Palworld. After playing Project Zomboid, I have developed a deep appreciation for functions like this. It truly sets a game apart from the rest, in my opinion. Letting people sculpt their own experiences to their liking in a large, open-ended, unforgiving, and often time-consuming game like this one is top-tier design. Having played a few survival games now, Palworld, Valheim, Project Zomboid, and a little bit of The Forest, I've gleaned that you spend a lot of time waiting. It makes sense. Tasks take time, and it adds to the immersion and whatnot. That being said, being able to say, hey, I don't want to wait, I want to experience the rest of the game feels extremely good, and I think it should be a function in all games like this. Long story short, world settings are usually a win. Palworld is a game that has had its share of controversies, alleged plagiarism, AI use. I know I've briefly mentioned some of these already, but I'm not here to deep dive into all of that. There are people who have made dedicated videos discussing those topics, and tacking all of that onto this already massive video would feel a little strange to me. Also, talking about that kind of stuff, it's just not my cup of tea. You know, I acknowledge the controversies. Have a quick Google session if you want to learn more about them. End of the day, the game is fun, so that's why I'm here. Elden Ring, Pokemon, and Ark Survival had a very strange child, and I have to say I'm a huge fan. If you've made it this far into the video, I recommend giving the game a shot if you haven't, because it's definitely worth trying. Also, with the price tag being as reasonable as it is with regards to the dollars spent per hour played comparison, if the game hooks you, it hooks you hard. You're gonna get stuck in this game. It is easy to sink a lot of time into it. At times, it can be a very relaxing management game, and at other times, you're fighting for your life. It's great. The devs have released a roadmap for what they plan to add to the game at this point, and I look forward to seeing what they can do. Hello! Wait! Not yet. The Pokemon situation is insane! I hate this timeline. As I was nearing the completion of this video, an announcement dropped for a new Pokemon game called Pokémon Champions. It looks to be a big step in the right direction for the franchise. Look at this. Pokemon embracing change and actually trying something new. It's great. However, I truly don't think this would have happened without Palworld succeeding as much as it has. And, judging by how hard Nintendo is suing Pocket Pair currently, they aren't too pleased with having to switch up the formula. While I'm glad this game will likely be a great time, it doesn't excuse the patent and copyright abuse that is currently taking place. This kind of stuff is what threatens the very idea of competition in the video game industry as a whole. Don't even get me started on what happened to the Nemesis system with the Middle-earth games and the Sanity system from Eternal... That game's hard to say. Don't even get me started on what happened to the Nemesis system from the Middle-earth games and the Sanity system from Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem.
First try.
This is just more of that needless corporate greed which currently plagues our world and will certainly, at some point, drive us into a new dark age. Anyways, my view on this new Pokemon game can be summed up as such. Great job, Nintendo. I'm very proud of you. So proud that I'm gonna have to boycott your game. And I'm not happy about it. Hello! Thank you so much for watching the video. It means the world. Have you played Palworld? What is your favorite pal? How do you feel about the stagnation of the Pokemon series? Let me know down below. Sorry this one took a while. It's pretty long. It was a lot of editing. And also, I had writer's block. I was struggling to decide on a topic for this video. And when it eventually hit, it hit. And I just kept going and kept pushing through. But we got it. We made it. The video's out. So I appreciate your patience. But on the bright side, I have like my next 4 videos figured out. Anyways, aside from all of that, if you enjoyed the video, be sure to like it and subscribe for more content. This video's been long enough, so I'll keep it short. With everything that's been said, I'll sign off. Thank you again so much for watching the video. It truly means the world. Stay safe out there, and I will see you in the next video. Have a good one.